I'm very pleased to be able to introduce today's speaker, Emily LeRoux-Rutledge, who is a professor at the University of West England. And she's going to be speaking to us about remote conflict stress and how ongoing violence in origin countries affects well-being. So welcome to York.
Great, thank you. Yes, so as Michaela has said, the topic of my presentation today is remote conflict stress, which is a theory we're developing about how ongoing violence in origin countries affects well-being. And I'd like to acknowledge my co-author as well, Carmen Lienen there. So here's a kind of a brief agenda for the talk today. I'll give you a bit of introduction, background, and some of the theorizing we're doing, methodology. Then I'll talk you through the findings that come from our South Sudanese diaspora case study, and the conclusions. Before I dive into the actual content of the presentation, I'll just give you a little bit of background brief about myself. So I'm on sabbatical for a year, and I'm very kindly being hosted here at the Center for Refugee Studies as a visiting scholar. During this time, I'm writing up a whole series of projects, which I'll tell you about on the next slide. At my university, I am the chair of the university's Global Migration Network, which is a network of scholars across the university that work on migration issues. And we run a kind of seminar series very much like this one throughout the year and do various kind of activities and events at the university. And I also organize something called the Asylum Seeker and Refugee Wellbeing Conference each year in the UK, which is an annual conference hosted at my university that brings together basically a lot of the different stakeholders in the local area who are working to support newcomers. That includes people from the healthcare sector, people from what we would call here settlement services, but there is called the NGO sector, people from academia, and people from local government as well. So we host that conference yearly in January. And just a little bit of background about me. Prior to becoming an academic, I worked in international development. I have been working in international development for 2 decades, conducting research. In that capacity, and also as an academic, I've conducted research in more than 25 countries globally across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. There's a map of some of the countries where I've worked. I've lived in a bunch of them as well. And these are just kind of a sample of some of the kind of previous work that I've done. So I kind of initially started out as a development scholar and then took a turn towards studying migration within the last 5 years or so. I thought I'd briefly tell you about the projects I'm working on this year. So the first one is the project I'm going to be presenting today, which is remote conflict stress. I'm also working on a project looking at media narratives about refugees before and after the start of the war in Ukraine. And that is based on a media content analysis of UK television public service broadcasters, where we coded 272 different news broadcasts over the course of a 1-year period, 6 months before and 6 months after the start of war in Ukraine, to see if the coverage of refugees and asylum seekers materially changed after the start of that conflict. I'm also working on a piece about public narratives about refugees and refugee claimants, which is trying to get at people's cognitive representations or narratives that they hold about refugees and asylum seekers. And that's through a story completion exercise with undergraduates at my university, where we give people a kind of a loose prompt to write a story about a refugee or an asylum seeker, and then we analyze thematically the stories that they produce. And the last piece of work that I'm working on this year is a piece of research on barriers to lived experience leadership in the refugee sector in the UK. So in the UK, the settlement services, they really have an underrepresentation of people with lived experience working in them, which I think is not the case in Canada, but it is there. And so 15 different organizations in Bristol approached me about doing this project. We ran focus groups with people with lived experience who both worked in the organizations and had previously worked in the organizations but left, as well as interviews with organizational leaders. And that's really a piece about sort of how organizational culture needs to adapt and change to accommodate people from different cultures and backgrounds if they want people with lived experience to work in the sector. So those are that's a kind of a whistle-stop tour of the different papers that I'm writing up this year. But I've decided to focus on the first one with you today, which is the one that is hopefully going to be submitted by the end of this month. Okay. So, introduction. So, it will probably not surprise you that refugees and asylum seekers have been found to have high and persistent rates of mental ill health, between 5 to 10 times greater than in the general population. I would like to say, however, that in this research, I'm not looking at refugees and asylum seekers only, but more broadly at what we call diaspora communities, of which refugees and asylum seekers often form an integral part. So diaspora communities, as we define them, are deterritorialized, imagined communities, which conceive of themselves, despite their dispersal, as sharing a collective past and common destiny, and hence a simultaneity in time. And our initial review of the literature showed us that when it comes to thinking about diasporal well-being, there's quite extensive research that looks at the contribution of pre-migration and transmigration stressors. So those are difficulties that have been faced in the past, based in events on events in one's place of origin or in transit to a new place of settlement. And extensive research looks at the contribution of post-migration stressors, so difficulties faced in the present based on events and circumstances occurring in one's new place of settlement. But surprisingly little research looks at the difficulties faced in the present based on events that are ongoing in one's place of origin. And that was where we saw a gap, and this is what we theorize as remote conflict stress. So this is our definition. We're defining remote conflict stress as stress experienced by individuals or groups due to ongoing conflict occurring in a geographic region with which they maintain a meaningful identity connection, such as their own place of origin or that of their parents, grandparents, or ancestors. We're not trying to be exclusive about the definition here. Whatever the identity connection is, whatever the nature of it is, it counts. And we theorize remote conflict stress to have 3 different dimensions: individual, interpersonal, and community. And I'll talk through each of those. This is just kind of a really quick preview of kind of our working model, which will make more sense when I get to the end of the presentation, but I'll give you a preview of it here. Effectively, what we're theorizing is that the identity connection to the country experiencing conflict then leads to vicarious exposure to ongoing events in that country in a way that is more intense and more extensive than a person who did not have such an identity connection. And that's through various forms of contact, both interpersonal networks as well as mediated communication, including through social media. And that this leads to remote conflict stress with its individual impacts on emotions, mental health, finances, and future plans. Its interpersonal impacts on transnational relationships and diasporic relationships, and its community impacts on community cohesion, capacity, and resilience. And that all of that is an impact on well-being. So it's just a preview of where we're going. Before I get into the data, I should acknowledge some related concepts, which I think are really important and interconnected with what we're talking about, but not exactly the same as. The first is vicarious trauma and also secondary traumatic stress. How about now? Test. Am I audible now? Can I not be heard by anybody who's?
It's faint.
It's faint. Okay.
So maybe speak. Sorry.
If I hold it up.
Okay.
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay. Better?
Yeah,
Okay.
maybe end user.
So yeah, I want to talk about a couple of related concepts. So vicarious trauma and secondary traumatic stress are very closely related concepts, slightly different, but vicarious trauma is cumulative, long-term, whereas secondary traumatic stress can be even one exposure. But both of these two concepts are about traumatic symptoms that people experience after being exposed to another person's traumatic experiences. And the problem with these two terms in the context of what we're talking about is that in the literature on vicarious trauma and secondary traumatic stress, they are almost exclusively examined in the context of helping professionals such as therapists, social workers, doctors, first responders, people in helping professions. So whilst vicarious trauma and secondary traumatic stress may be a mechanism through which remote conflict stress affects diaspora populations, these terms have really not been applied to diaspora populations, as far as we can see. Then there is the concept of intergenerational trauma, which is the transmission of the effects of trauma from one generation to the next. That certainly also is at play at the same time as remote conflict stress, but this is a different concept because this is relating to events that have occurred in the past that are being transmitted through the family, not events that are ongoing in the present. So it interacts with what we think is conceptually distinct from remote conflict stress. And the final term that I should acknowledge is survivor's guilt, which is remorse or guilt for having survived a life-threatening experience when others did not. This typically follows direct exposure to a life-threatening event. Doesn't have to, but typically does. Remote conflict stress is not necessary to have had firsthand experience of the conflict that's ongoing. But also survivor's guilt, I think, is a very, it might form a part of remote conflict stress, but it's a very narrow part. There's a lot more based on our findings than simply that. So you may see all of these kind of concepts coming into play a little bit in the quotations, I think, but I would argue that there's more going on than just these things. Okay, let me give you a tiny little bit of background about South Sudan. Before I do that, can you just wave a hand if you know a little something about South Sudan? There are people in the room that do. Okay, but if you did not, okay, so I'll kind of do the really basic version then. So South Sudan, which was the gray and red part of the map originally, gained independence from colonial powers in the mid-50s, and quite quickly civil war commenced because the South wanted to secede from the North and be independent from the North. So that conflict continued up until about the mid-70s when there was peace. The peace lasted for about a decade, and then in the mid-80s, it commenced again, and that conflict ran all the way up until 2005. And effectively, the two parts of what was then Sudan really were, this is a very broad brush way of saying it, but they were quite different, both in terms of their religion and ethnicity. So the north of Sudan primarily tended to be Muslim and Arab, and the south primarily tended to be Black African and Christian and or animist. And the desire for independence on the part of the south, I think, was largely driven by a perception of being kind of second-class citizens in Sudan and wishing for their own independence in their own nation. So in 2005, there was a peace agreement, which had a stipulation in it for a referendum, which was then held in 2011. I think it was 99% of people voted to have South Sudan secede, and South Sudan became the world's youngest country in 2011. There was a well-established South Sudanese diaspora abroad. Many of them came to countries like Canada and the UK in the 80s when the conflict resumed there. And so for many, many decades, that diaspora was elsewhere but supporting, and many of them originally came as refugees, but now, of course, mostly have citizenship. And they were kind of supporting the independence struggle from abroad. In 2013, 2 years after the country gained independence, very sadly, a conflict began in the new country. That's the red part. So basically there were two power holders, the president and the vice president, who came from two different tribes because there are different tribes within South Sudan. The president was a Dinka and the vice president was a Nuer, and they got into a power struggle and they fanned interethnic conflict in order to kind of mobilize their respective bases. And that turned into a complex interethnic conflict, which in very simplistic terms could be broken down into a conflict between the Dinka and the Nuer, but there are many other tribes in South Sudan that were involved as well. So that happened in 2013, and that kind of was I was there in 2013, a few months before this happened, and it was really quite devastating time, both of course for South Sudan, but also for the diaspora. Nominally, there was a peace agreement in 2018. I think it hasn't really held in terms of, there's certainly still violence going on in South Sudan today. So you could say that it's been in a more or less protracted state of violence since 2013. It's a really broad summary of the conflict. Okay. So the methodology, for instance. So we did in-depth interviews with 25 first and second generation members of the South Sudanese diaspora. That's people born in South Sudan who then moved, and also people who were not born in South Sudan, who were their children, born in the UK or born in Canada. We did 13 interviews in Canada, 12 in the UK. The interviews lasted about an hour and a half. I'm not going to talk too much about the method, but if people want to know, I can talk about that afterwards. We also did 15 in-depth interviews with the practitioners who specialize in supporting refugees and asylum seekers in the healthcare sector and the NGO sector, unfortunately only in the UK, to kind of supplement this from a practitioner perspective. And then we obviously transcribed those interviews and did a thematic network analysis. Here's just a very quick breakdown of the sample, just out of curiosity. As you can see, the respondents ranged from 18 to 63. Slightly skewed male, more first generation than second, and slightly more newer than Dinka, but that was the breakdown in the sample. And today I'm going to be reporting on the results together. So I'm really going to be talking about the kind of commonalities, both across the Canada and the UK, and the commonalities across generation and across tribe as well. So I'm talking about the things that resonated across the data. If people are interested in differences, I can also talk a little bit about it at the end, but that's not the emphasis for this one. Okay, so the first thing that I think that's really important, and that's important from the perspective of our theory about the identification piece, is that everybody we spoke to was very
Will just immediately transfer, so it's just no problem. Okay,
What?
so that's good. So you are cooking the.
Can I be heard?
Yeah, somebody just remuted themselves.
And I apologize, I'm going to give you a lot to read today, but I think for me, quotes are really the richness. I really bring out the material, so I'm going to give you just a minute to read the quotations on the slide. But this just gives you a flavor of the kind of identification we're talking about. For the slides, the blue bubbles are the UK quotes and the pink ones are the Canada quotes, and you can see this identification was shared among first and second generation alike. And that was really notable how strongly identified the South Sudan the second generation was. Now, the next piece that's important is the vicarious exposure to violence piece. So the participants were vicariously exposed to what was happening in South Sudan, certainly via personal networks, via media, including social media, including images and videos. That was very clear from the interviews. So there's another few quotes that just demonstrate that. Other platforms that were mentioned included, you know, WhatsApp and Twitter and other kinds of social media platforms as well. So certainly there was the identification, and certainly there was also the vicarious exposure to what was happening. So talking about the individual impacts of this. So ongoing violence had a profound effect on emotions, mental health, financial security, and future plans. And I'll talk about each of those in turn. People reported many emotions in response to the ongoing violence, including sadness, pain, shock, guilt, anxiety, anger, and hatred. And here are some indicative quotations. Sadness was one of the most frequently mentioned emotions. This is all particularly in reference to 2013 onward, if that wasn't clear. Again and again, and this was surprising to us, people spontaneously talked about mental health and attributed mental ill health to the vicarious exposure to the violence. second example, the person was talking about having to take stress leaves from work in two periods, 2015 and also 16, when there was particularly bad violence in South Sudan. And these mental health effects seem to be felt across both the first generation and the second generation. So I'll let you read this and then I can just say a little bit about this one. So this is a 1.5 generation person talking about the effect of receiving bad news about the death of a family member on her mother and how this caused significant depression in her mother. Equally, here's another one of a first generation participant talking about their second generation child. And this child had been suffering from mental ill health for quite a few years. And what was remarkable about that was, yes, the child had visited South Sudan, but at that time, they weren't in an area of violence. The child hadn't actually been exposed to any violence that had been shown images while in South Sudan, what was going on in other parts of the country, and the child had spontaneously attributed the onset of their mental ill health to that incident and said that was really what set it all off. Now onto financial security. Ongoing violence also affects financial security, and people talked about this a lot because money has to be continually sent to South Sudan to support people. People just talked about sending every single spare dollar that they had back, and therefore having absolutely no buffer, no safety zone, no safety net, no savings whatsoever. And also they talked about the ongoing violence impacting their ability to progress into their futures. What was interesting is that this included, so basically the ongoing violence was interrupting their future plans. And those future plans included plans to return to South Sudan. So people talked about how they had planned to return or wanted to return, but this was going to be impossible. But also that the ongoing violence in South Sudan was impacting their plans or their attempts to progress in the UK and Canada even, as these two different quotes illustrate. Technical is basically talking about how the mental load, the preoccupation of worry and concern about what was happening there kind of affected people's morale and their ability to kind of move forward in their lives in the new place. And also the financial piece was another factor in this. At the same time, participants also reflected on how the situation in South Sudan in some ways gave them a sense of purpose. And here are two example quotations about that. The first one is talking about somebody who's raising money to support South Sudanese orphans. And the second one is a second generation person saying that whenever he thinks about studying or doing a course, he's always thinking about in the long run, if I went to South Sudan, how would this help? How would this help the country? Okay. Now, we'll move on to the interpersonal impacts. It's probably evident to you already that these are sort of porous categories because the individual is never purely individual. It blends into the interpersonal, it blends into the community. So I do acknowledge that there's definitely kind of themes go across these levels, but I still think it's a helpful kind of conceptual framework in order to think about it. So on the interpersonal side, what we found was that the ongoing violence had profound effects on both the transnational relationships between family members and diaspora with those still in South Sudan, but also on family relationships of people living together in diaspora. Both kinds of relationships seem to be disrupted and impacted by the violence. So the relationships with those in South Sudan, these two particular quotations are talking about just basically the rupture people felt in terms of not being close with, not being with, you know, their loved ones in South Sudan. So in the first example, it's a second generation young person just talking about the sense of loss they felt about not having met their grandfather until very recently and not having grown up with the family members who they should have, but by all rights, been close to. And the second quotation is similar of a young person who went and met a whole bunch of family members who were then killed. So, give me a minute to read those. Kinds of interpersonal effects that we saw in the relationships with people still in South Sudan. Of course, the worry was a huge one, just the simple worry about the well-being and the lives of the family members still there, which was pretty constant and pervasive. There were also some people who talked, who'd been in diaspora for a very long time, who talked about, you know, how the relationships with the family members home, the love was still there, but they'd also become a bit distant because they'd been gone for so long that they sort of didn't talk in the same way anymore, say with their sister still in South Sudan as they used to because of the length of time that they'd been apart, even though the family connection and the love was still there. So the relationships were affected with those obviously still in South Sudan, but also with those in diaspora. So one thing we really noticed was an impact on parent-child relationships in diaspora. There's a couple of examples, and then I'll speak a bit more about this. So parents talk about not having enough time to spend with their children in diaspora and not having the attention and focus on their kids in Canada and the UK that they should have had because they were spending so much time and effort worrying about the family back home and also spending time working to get more money so that they could make sort of every dollar that they possibly could in order to send back to South Sudan because they felt that it was literally a matter of life and death for the people still there. Children actually interestingly talked, I'm not sure if I have a quote on this, but children, no, I don't. Children talked about, in some cases, like deep resentment about the fact that their parents sent all the money home and like they were living in poverty and basically didn't have, just were barely making ends meet and really resenting the fact that the people in South Sudan kept asking for more and more and more, and as if they thought we were living in Buckingham Palace or something like this. So there was definitely a tension and a strain that came between children and their parents as a result of what was happening in South Sudan. And there was a very poignant quote as well about a parent saying, you know, I really haven't explained it too much to them. I haven't gone into too much detail about what's happening there because I don't want to make them have hatred in their hearts. So there was definitely like a feeling that there was also the parents a little bit holding back the reality of the situation from the children. And there was also talk about impacts on, here's two other kind of familial relationships, so marriages, and then also sibling relationships. In the first case, the gentleman had for a short time gone back to South Sudan to help, and he felt that this had caused a rupture between his wife and children, and this is why he was separated now from them. And in the second case, it's a person just talking about how they fight with their siblings all the time because it's like, no, it's your turn to send money, it's your turn to send money, I did it last week, etc. So there were serious effects on interpersonal relationships in diaspora as well. Okay, and the last level is the community impacts. And this is actually, the examples I'm going to give you here are actually what spurred me to start this research in the first place. So both the first and the second generation diaspora highlighted how the new configuration of violence in South Sudan in 2013 between the previously allied ethnic groups had profoundly affected the community cohesion of the diaspora, which had been previously a source of support for people. And this is, remember, after 30 years of cohesiveness and togetherness. the outbreak of violence between the Dinka and the Nuer in South Sudan in 2013 had ripple effects across the diaspora in a similar way. The community capacity to kind of mobilize was also affected. Some people asserted claims of community resilience, and I will share a few quotes of those with you, but they were like much less frequent than the comments about the rupture in the community. So here are a couple of quotes from the Canadian diaspora about the impact of the 2013 conflict. So by all accounts, the South Sudanese community in Canada basically stopped gathering together from 2015 onward, and we saw exactly the same pattern in the UK. And it's not just that those ethnic differences became more salient. It actually appeared, some people asserted that they became salient really for the first time ever. Another subtle difference, subtly different way that it affected community was just in terms of the community's kind of capacity to organize. So obviously it affected the cohesion, but it also, you know, just affected the capacity in terms of not having funds, you know, not having the kind of energy and effort to kind of even organize because you're thinking about people back home and, you know, you don't do anything for the community, don't have any funds to run the community center to get the community together. So if there was a will, this person was saying even then it wouldn't be possible because we just don't have the capacity to get the community together anymore after 2013. And as I said, there were some people who talked about community resilience. So here are a couple of quotes on that theme. So a few people like were keen to really say, no, we're trying to bring the community back together. But this was not the prevailing sentiment. The prevailing sentiment was that the rupture persisted even today. Okay, now, so that takes us to the end of the kind of substantive examples from the South Sudanese diaspora in terms of the theory of remote conflict stress. I just want to add a piece onto this from our practitioner interviews, because we also spoke to, as I said, healthcare professionals that were working in mental health with refugees and asylum seekers, as well as people in the NGO sector who were working with refugees and asylum seekers to support them in the kind of settlement services area. And we asked them if they had noticed this or if they had, you know, did this resonate with their experiences of working with people? And so I want to highlight a few of their responses. So in the health sector, what we found is that the mental health practitioners who were working usually on individualistic one-to-one therapies with people who were dealing with PTSD, refugees and asylum seekers dealing with PTSD, they wanted people to switch off from what was happening in their place of origin. And here are a couple of indicative quotes from two different mental health practitioners. What you see is just basically enormous frustration on the part of the mental health practitioners that people just continue to do this thing which is bad for them, which is accessing the information about what's happening in the origin country. In addition, they seem to lack sort of strategies to help people deal with remote conflict stress. So this is a quote from both a mental health practitioner and also a family doctor who deals exclusively with refugee and asylum seeker clients. So they kind of acknowledge that, yeah, we see it, it happens, but like almost characterizing it as a pathology, like it's something that's like, you know, what one person called it a PTSD compulsion to be viewing videos and kind of YouTube clips. Yeah, almost as if it was like something that people were kind of unhealthily addicted to. And not really having any strategies to manage this over and above individual therapeutic work, or just not really having any training to deal with it at all. In the NGO sector, it was interesting. There was a sentiment that this kind of thing, the diaspora communities are best placed to support each other with it. So like, we don't know what's going on. We don't necessarily know the intricacies of what's happening. You know, it's probably their community is the right place for them to get support for this kind of thing. So there are some examples. And then the second quote illustrates kind of sort of a bemused like response when, you know, sometimes we try to put people in contact with their community, but you know, they don't want to get to know people from a similar background, and we don't really get that, you know. Why would they not be wanting to get support from their community around things like this? And obviously, if you think about the rift, you know, in the South Sudanese community, you can see that a community is not necessarily a, you know, cohesive whole. I would say that we basically, in the paper that we're almost finished and we'll be submitting shortly. We're making, first and foremost, I would say, a theoretical contribution with the theory of remote conflict stress experienced by individuals or groups due to ongoing conflict in a geographic region with which they maintain a meaningful identity connection. And the kind of model that I talked you through before, the identity connection being what drives the heightened vicarious exposure to the information, and then that leading to these different impacts. And I should as well say that, like, I don't necessarily think that if you were to apply this framework to a different diaspora group, I don't necessarily think that the individual interpersonal community impacts would necessarily be exactly the same for each group. In fact, I wouldn't necessarily expect them to be the same. But I think there would be individual interpersonal and community impacts, which is one of the reasons why we picked those kind of levels. The second contribution is an empirical contribution in terms of offering insights about the effects of ongoing violence in South Sudan on the South Sudanese diaspora in the UK and Canada. And finally, just to conclude, I think we're making an applied contribution in two ways. First of all, I think we're highlighting that remote conflict stress is an overlooked post-migration stressor that clearly has profound and multi-layered impacts, and that I think current sort of ideas like survivor's guilt really don't capture the full extent of it. And second of all, it would appear that healthcare and NGO workers who support diaspora populations may be lacking the strategies that they need to address remote conflict stress. That's the end of the presentation, the references.